I always feel like my story starts with my parents. No? I'm the daughter of my mother, who's a Cuban exile, my father, Mexican immigrants, and so both of them came to this country for different reasons, but sort of similar reasons that I think really shaped who I am.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program, Defectors, the Rise of the Latino Far Right and What It Means for America. Backstage, Paula was making fun of me because I made bookmarks.
I was like, so nerdy, of course.
I was joking with her. I'm like, yep, there's my dad, there's my dad, there's my dad. But for formal introductions, again, my name is Christian Arana. I'm the Vice President of Civic Power and Policy at the Latino Community Foundation. Thank you. We are the nation's largest Latino-serving foundation, headquartered here in San Francisco, so it's a point of pride for us to be here. I see some of our San Francisco friends here. I'm so excited to be here with Paula Ramos. As many of you know, Paula is a journalist and author who has just contributed significantly to the conversation around Latino identity and politics. You may also remember her from her first book, Finding Latinx, which I encourage you to also buy and read. And she's an MSNBC and Telemundo contributor. I was telling Paula backstage that we first met over a decade ago. We crossed paths in DC when she was working in the Obama administration. Just a very short story. I was working at the Aspen Institute, and you were running at the advanced team for Dr. Jill Biden, who was then second lady of the United States. And she was running late. I was super stressed.
We were both stressed.
We were both very stressed, right? And so we got into the elevator, and there was Paula, the second lady, all these Secret Service agents, and my shoe split. Literally splits open.
But no one noticed.
No one noticed, thank God, because the entire time I was like, oh God, please, no one, please look at me right now.
And also because the second lady is so fancy, right? And just always fabulous. So it's, yes.
No, for
I
sure.
felt that way oftentimes.
Yeah, exactly. So now over a decade later, I have shoes with no holes, and I get to share the stage. At the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco.
Yes. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. So Paula, how are you? Good to see you.
I am tired, but I am so happy to be here, and thank you. I just want to start by thanking you for doing this with me, and thank you to all of you for being here. I know there's a million things that are happening, and life is happening, and everything feels tense, but I really do never take this for granted, and so thank you so much for making the time. Really.
Awesome, thank you. And this is your first stop in California, right?
That's right.
That's right, because you've been in Arizona, New York, and so.
I woke up in Phoenix, and now, but once I landed today, I was like, all right, this feels more like home. It feels good. It does. It does.
So the flow of tonight, for the first 45 minutes or so, I want to ask Paula about herself, the book, some current events that are happening in our country today about Latinos and where our vote may go in this year's presidential election, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So as we have the conversation, I really do encourage everybody to, I think you have cards on your chairs where you can submit some questions. So Paula, right off the bat, I read the bio. You're an author, you're a journalist, but who are you? I think it's important to know who the author is, the person behind writing the book. So if you want to share your personal story with us.
That's the first. Who am I? Well, I always feel like my story starts with my parents. No? I'm the daughter of my mother, who's a Cuban exile, my father, Mexican immigrants, and so both of them came to this country for different reasons, but sort of similar reasons that I think really shaped who I am. But it was my household, no matter where I was always, it was politics and journalism.
Sure.
Both of my parents are journalists. And my grandfather was a journalist, and so that was the core of every single dinner conversation. I grew up between Miami and Madrid, sort of ping-ponging between those two cities since I was 2 until I was 17 years old.
Oh, wow.
And so even the idea of and this comes up in conversation all the time, which I think is kind of at the core of the book and this conversation, which is this idea of belonging. Where do we belong? In what spaces do we feel welcomed? And I think for many years, I've sort of, when I was in Spain, I felt more Cuban. When I'm in Miami, I feel more Mexican. When I'm in New York, suddenly everything makes more sense, but I still wrestle with that.
Sure, no, yeah, and thank you for sharing your story, because, as I was preparing for tonight, as we go into this election, all these numbers are being thrown around, right? 36 million eligible Latino voters. You write about this beautifully in your first book that, Latinos, Latinx, like, we're anyone and everyone, really. And so I think my first question off the bat, we're young voters, we're voters from Mexico, we're independent voters, but why focus on this specific group of, as you describe, a small but growing in influence and power, Latinos who are choosing the far right?
Because I feel like we've normalized that. And I feel like there's a tendency, not you, but among some sort of Democratic pollsters and progressive groups, there's a tendency these days to sort of see those numbers that Donald Trump is reaching, between 35 to 40% of the Latino vote. And people tend to dismiss that. And I think that normalizes what's happening. Now, the idea that someone like Donald Trump, that is promising mass deportations, that is using very alarming language, that is sort of really, really effectively trying to divide us, the fact that he is capable of even reaching 40% of that vote, I think that has less to do with politics and more to do with something deeper. And I think that's kind of the question here, like, is what's happening the Trump effect, or is it a symptom of sort of this bigger shift? I've spent my whole life in Democratic politics before I turned into journalism. And so much, as you know, so much of sort of the theory of change of Democratic politics was this idea that this wouldn't happen, that today we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? The idea was that today, in the face of someone like Donald Trump, this would never happen, right? That we would sort of show up in these unprecedented numbers, that we would be this sort of solid part of that multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition, and that this fracturing that's happening wouldn't be part of our story. And so I think, unfortunately, I was crazy enough to dig into it, and I think normalizing it perhaps does a disservice to who we are.
Yeah, and something that I was laughing throughout the book, as ironic as that sounds, because I was so surprised to see so many examples of California Latinos
Well, why?
in your book. Well, no, I mean, I think my favorite story, and for those who are purchasing the book, you'll eventually see it. But my favorite story was a man named Ivan from Southern California, who is Mexican American, who is just so in love with President Bukele to the point, from El Salvador, to the point that he had a cupcake birthday party for him, right? And you talk about this in your book about how this love for a strong man style of leadership, and how that may be a reason why Latinos are moving to the far right. And I think in that question, the question I have here is, how did you go about finding these people? As you did this book and did the research, what was the process like in getting these stories into the book?
Well, the process was, so I think as journalists, you typically go in and out of these places, and you never have time to really think about what you're seeing. We go in, we spend max 2-3 days, do the story, edit it, it goes on air, move on. And so I think once I had the time to really take a step back and make sense of everyone that I had been talking to in the last 4 or 5 years, and really reflect on that, then the idea of Defectors really sort of was born, making sense of the conversations that I was having at the border, or in the Bronx, or in California, or on the phone. Sometimes conversations that had absolutely nothing to do with this topic, but I think the idea is that I started noticing that in very subtle ways, this language has started to emerge, The warming up to the mass deportations, the warming up to people like Bukele, warming up to Christian nationalism. And so once I took that step back and really brought in people that really guided me to make sense of things, scholars, psychologists, historians, and that was really the fruit of that.
Would you say there's a favorite story in this book for you?
Well, you mentioned that. You mentioned him. So Bukele, Bukele is such a fascinating person. He's obviously cast himself as, what does he say? He's like the world's coolest
dictator,
right. Or the world's coolest millennial dictator. He is beloved, in El Salvador, beloved in all over Latin America. And so I think he poses this idea of there are moments in which, as a community, we're willing to give up certain rights for the sake of our safety. And I think sort of Bukele represents that. So I think it was interesting because randomly in conversation, so many people, Democrats, independents, obviously some Republicans, they were obsessed with Bukele, regardless of whether they were from...
Well, he spoke at CPAC, didn't he?
He did, yeah. But even like Democrats. And so sometimes when I was having conversations with random people, in the conversation, they would unconsciously make a connection between Bukele and Trump. And then kind of talking about the same idea of sort of democracy feeling messy around them. Sure. They felt unease, they felt like unsafe, they felt a lot of things that Republicans are sort of pushing them to feel. And then that sort of then draws this direct line towards Bukele and Trumpism. And so to bring it back to history, that is a pattern that I think is very familiar among us. This idea that we have also been sort of conditioned to believe in Latin America that at times strongman rule is necessary. When, particularly in the name of curing the West from communism, or right. from violence. And so at a time where we are right now, where there's a party and there's many elements that are trying to create and paint that image of this uncomfortable America, this dystopian America, right. Bukele and Trump make sense for some people.
Yeah, and I think you label that as the word trauma in your book as one of the main buckets, right, of why Latinos may be moving towards the far right. I'm curious, as a follow-up to that question, and for folks who are going to start to read this book, you break it down to three areas, right? Mm-hmm. Tribalism, traditionalism, and trauma. I wonder if you could just give like a sneak peek to the audience about like what you mean by each of those and whether or not one may be stronger than the other?
Yeah. So I think when you look at the sort of the Trump Latino phenomenon, I think the tendency, and at the beginning that's sort of what the book was going to be, just a political book, is I think the tendency is to explain it through the Trump effect. What I thought was maybe harder and more difficult is to talk about the more uncomfortable conversations that I wish I would have had growing up. How do we explain sort of the role of colonialism and what effect did that have in the racial baggage that we're carrying from Latin America here? How do we explain the internalized racism, the colorism, and how does that manifest in American politics? So I sort of labeled that the tribalism. Then I thought about traditionalism. Again, understanding the way that colonialism really shaped our moral compass. So that when there's these efforts to really use transphobic language or anti-LGBTQ language, what about that language really like invokes this moral panic among us? What resonates? And then finally, the trauma, the political trauma, whether it's the story that we know. I grew up in Miami, so the story of communism, that paranoia of communism is very real, but then also this very complicated relationship that I think as Latinos we have with authoritarianism. And I think Democrats believe that if you cast Donald Trump as a dictator, you're good. There's no way.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's very complicated. Some people want run towards that image.
Yeah, and I'm curious, as I was reading the book, I was just fascinated how you were just hanging out with a bunch of January 6th insurrectionists.
Yeah, hanging out,
hanging out, right? Interviewing them for this book, right? And it just got me thinking, I'm like, that must be tough, talking to people that...
Well, I think and I'm sure for you too, and for people in the room, the hardest part right now is to build trust with anyone and to have anyone that is getting them to talk to me. So that took a lot of effort. But look, those conversations in those spaces were uncomfortable. I think the image of a queer Latina with a circle that is very different from a lot of the Latino insurrectionists that I interviewed was deeply uncomfortable for them. I go in with these sort of biases, they go in with their own biases, and so that's undeniable, obviously. I think, what's interesting though, even I'm thinking of Enrique Tarrio, for instance, the former chairman of the Proud Boys. And, online, he seemed like this super macho, super tough guy, always hiding in his sunglasses. and it was intimidating. It definitely was intimidating. That was one of the worst interviews that I've done because I'm visibly shaking in that interview at the beginning. And then once you really sort of put the politics aside, they all have the same sort of through line, no?
Sure.
Which is, Enrique is someone that wasn't really fitting in our Miami, I have super light skin. Enrique's a black Cuban in Miami. That is really hard, Very, very hard. And so he's someone that was always, in his own words, considered too black to be a Republican, he would say, too weird to be an independent. Democrats never knocked on his door when they were campaigning in Miami-Dade County. So I think in the Proud Boys and through these conversations with them, you're able to sort of humanize the extremism. And I know that sounds weird, but you're able to humanize the sense of belonging that he found in suddenly being accepted by these Proud Boys that didn't just give him that community that maybe he lacked, but gave him power. And that power, I think then sort of that totally became rotten and it radicalized him. But there's moments in those interviews that you can get through just being uncomfortable and just understand who this guy is, he was this like lonely guy in Miami, that just...
Right. Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, did you ever face any blowback in this process of like, why would you even talk to some of these folks?
Oh, all the time. No. I mean, look, if there's many times, like even whether it's with MSNBC or any platform, I think there's this debate, Is it worth it to give them a platform? And who gains anything from that? And so I receive a lot of pushback, but I believe that if you are armed with the fact-checking, I think it's important to expose what is happening. I think it's important for people to understand that this is happening, because I also think that there is a world in which we can all collectively ground people back into the facts. I think it's very easy to sort of dismiss a lot of these characters as these sort of like crazy MAGA Latinos. Some are. For sure. I think that's the lazy thing for me. I think the harder part is understanding like what is it about them? What is it about their journey? And sometimes it has nothing to do with politics. It's about breaking down, all right, like where does this racism come from? Why do you view women this way? What about the communism? Like, let's break that down. Let me ground you back into the facts. I think there's something to that, and I don't think it's for everyone though. Like, I also value people that don't think that's an important strategy.
No, absolutely. One of the other questions I wanted to ask you tonight, we're here in San Francisco. This is a city and a county that has a long track record being a sanctuary city, a state proudly a sanctuary state, especially during the Trump years. I see Ani agreeing with that. I think it's important to point out that 30 years ago next month, this state passed Prop 187, right? And for folks that may need a reminder, this was a ballot initiative that sought to ban social services for undocumented folks. And if history is a reminder, like the Latino and immigrant community, we organized, we became citizens, we voted, we ran for office, and we won. So the question here, Paula, is that, I see all these new polls that show, even here in California, there was a poll today that showed that Vice President Harris had 54% support among Latino voters, whereas President Biden back in 2020 got about 70%. So there is like a drop, right? On top of that, as I was explaining to you backstage, Latinos have now very slightly left the Democratic Party and become registered Republicans. And so...
In California.
In California. And so, as you make reference in this book, it's a small but growing force. And so my question here is like, how broad is this? Because when I think about like conservative Latinos or Republican Latinos, like, oh, like just Florida or Texas, but we're kind of seeing it here, right? I don't know if you know.
Well, look, again, coming from Miami, the idea was always that Miami was the exception. That what Donald Trump did in Miami-Dade County, for instance, which was really close those margins, and compared to what Hillary Clinton got, I think Clinton had over 20%, and then he sort of closed it to just 6% for the Democrats in 2020. And so I think that was always, the Democrats would always say, look, that's an exception. This isn't happening anywhere else. But I think if we're not alarmed by the idea that he can even poll more than 35%, like I think that's problematic. Republicans typically have gotten at least 30% of the vote, no? But I think I treat Trumpism different. I also think there's other studies, like Telemundo just had a poll 2 weeks ago, and they found when you ask Latinos who's the better leader, who has the better character across party lines, they will overwhelmingly choose her. Overwhelmingly, the margins are huge. And then when you start asking them in which party best represents your values, I think for the first time in years that margin has really, really started to shrink. And so I think there is something deeper happening, but I also think that the other side of the story, which is not to your point, I don't touch on that, but I think the flip side of it is you're absolutely right. From SB 1070, from California's history, that also created this incredible mobilized Latino community that I believe is at the heart of sort of the Democratic Party's chances of winning. And I think what we're also seeing is maybe not more younger Latinos that are choosing Republicans or to be independent, but I think they're demanding more from the party, and that's the difference. No? They're demanding more from the Democratic Party. They want them to be more challenged. They expect them to follow through on certain promises, particularly in a state where there's so much at risk. No, we have someone that's promising to separate families once again. And so I think the expectation is even higher. And so I think there's a real element of people are very disillusioned. And that's real. And I think that's a big thing that the Democrats are up against.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the Latino Community Foundation just commissioned a poll that we released last month that found that over half of registered Latinos in the state of California said that they haven't even been contacted at all. By anybody, not the Democrats, not the Republicans, not even some of the groups that we support, right? Because you got to take things to scale. Just like as a follow-up question to everything that you were saying, there was another poll. I'm a big fan of polls, right? It's useful data sometimes, right? Depends on the pollster that you ask. But I mean, earlier this, I think it was in January actually, UC Berkeley had a poll asking voters here in this state about their views about undocumented immigrants and whether or not they're a burden to the state. Over 60% of Latinos agreed and said that they felt that undocumented immigrants were a burden. And you talk about this in the initial chapters of your book. But the question here is, how does a Latino who may be an immigrant or a child of immigrants like myself, how do they land in a position where they do support, let's say, a Donald Trump, or just policies of mass deportations or asylum restrictions? How do they get to that point?
I mean, I think there's many things happening at once, right? I think when you have a Republican platform that for the past 4 years has been telling Americans every single day that there's an invasion, that migrants and asylum seekers are here to threaten you, that you feel unsafe. I mean, I live in New York City, and the fear is so palpable even there. Now, even though we're miles and miles away from the southern border, like that rhetoric is really, really sort of getting into people's psyche. I mean, even the vice presidential debate compared this time to 4 years ago. 4 years ago, they mentioned immigration 0 times. The word immigrant 0 times, the border 1 time. And here we are in a completely different environment where you have the Trump campaign that is really trying, I believe, to reenact that 2016 build the wall moment because it worked. And so every day they're doing this. And so I think there's an element of like that mis and disinformation works. B, just because we are descendants of immigrants and Latinos, none of that makes us immune to believing and taking in those sentiments. Again, we come from histories and countries where racial hierarchies and social hierarchies have been deeply ingrained in us. No? So this idea of who gets up the ladder first is very real. And then the second or third element is that we've really changed as a community. You know, who we are now is so different from who we were 30 years ago. We are more assimilated, we're more American, we're younger, we speak English. And so there's something real about, and I think that's kind of the uncomfortable question, right? I think there's a sector of Latinos that see themselves simply more reflected in Trump's image of America, right? We may perceive ourselves as this, but there's a group of people that don't see themselves reflected in sort of this, again, going back to this idea of this like allegiance to us, to the collective us. And there's also some truth to that because, again, America, who criminalizes immigrants every day, who criminalizes brown people, even makes a lot of American Latinos believe that they are these perpetual foreigners, that they don't belong here. And so when you add all these elements together, it turns people into
Yeah.
wanting to be part of the in-group, no, not the out-group.
Yeah, and on the vice presidential debate, I was actually listening to it on the radio because I was driving from the Imperial County. You make reference in the book about how even here in California, that border county,
He did really well there.
very well.
Yeah.
It was just fascinating to me how the vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance was blaming the housing crisis on immigrants. Right?
Everything. That's it. No, every problem that the United States has become the problem of immigrants, and so that strategy works really well. And then when you sort of when you combine that with the anti-blackness, no, the xenophobia and the anti-blackness together combined, there's a reason why the image of black migrants eating pets is something that they're trying to like instill in people's brains, right? Because it doesn't just instill fear and anger, it also instills disgust. And those elements together are very powerful, and that's all they have at this moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Diving deeper into something you mentioned a little bit earlier about misinformation, disinformation, I actually do think this conversation is very relevant for the Bay Area. And the reason why I say that is because, in this age of generative AI and deepfakes and, just everything that we have access to on our phones now, I'm curious, I'm wondering, are we being fooled into the far right because of this? Or is this fuel that's being added to a fire that's already burning in our households?
Like, how susceptible are we?
Yeah.
Or is it just, I think even just as a baseline, and everyone knows here, no? The mis and disinformation in Spanish language platforms goes unchecked and unmonitored at way higher percentages than it does in English. And I think I noted a study there from Abbas, and they found that at least 70% of misinformation in English in Facebook is flagged, and just 30% of misinformation in Spanish is flagged, right? And so there's this huge sort of discrepancy there.
Sure, yeah.
And then I think for decades, they've been really doing a brilliant job at manipulating the essence of language and the meaning of language, right? Where you go to Florida and los demócratas son comunistas, Obamacare es socialismo, Black Lives Matter son radicales, periodista, radical, right? So that's been going on for years and years. So that's another thing that we're up against. And then also on top of that, the added element of to your point before, like there's so much mistrust. So who do you trust? And I always go back to this conversation that I actually had here in the Central Valley with Rosario. And during COVID, I would ask Rosario, have you heard of Dr. Fauci? And she had never heard of Dr. Fauci. She was getting the information from her pastor in Latin America that was telling her not to take the vaccine, that was telling her not to put masks. And so who we trust is another added layer in all of this. And so I think we're kind of in the middle of this perfect storm.
Yeah, it's tough. I feel like I'm always on TikTok.
Who can fix it?
Yeah, exactly. I spend way too much time on TikTok.
But we have to, no? But that's the thing.
I know.
Me too.
Yeah,
I reluctantly joined.
Just get off TikTok and go to work. But I want to switch to some of the current events that are happening right now, because I think I feel like some of these questions will draw out some of the things that you write in this book. So this Saturday, former President Donald Trump is coming to California.
That's right.
He is holding a rally in the city of Coachella, California. Calm down, everybody. For most of the country, we know Coachella as like this big music festival. Like I think Kanye performed one year.
Come on, you know why?
Yeah, I know, right? I was there.
Yeah, me too. I was too.
But for us at the Latino Community Foundation, like there are a lot of nonprofit organizations that we invest in. And for us, the city of Coachella is a beautiful farm worker community that I think is deserving of our love and our respect. Yeah. What do you think Donald Trump is trying to accomplish here by going to a city that's like almost 100% Latino?
Well, it's how we felt when he went to the Bronx. We were all like, what the hell? Like, why? What is he doing in the Bronx? It was the same as New Yorkers. We were like, how dare he go to the Bronx? Like, there's no way. And then you zoomed into the images, and sure enough, like it wasn't huge, but there were a lot of Latinos there, and it's the same thing. It's the confidence that they're sort of displaying in. We can walk into these territories territories that you believe have been deeply blue. And we're going to send a message. And the message, of course, isn't for California. The message resonates across the country, It's for people in Arizona, it's for people in Nevada, it's for people in New York, and it's the confidence that it takes for someone to walk into these, what were once considered blue territories.
Wow, yeah. And actually, my follow-up question, I mean, this wasn't
But
part
what
of
do you actually, I want to know, what do you, I mean, you're here.
I mean, yeah. And I was actually just there. I mean, it's pretty incredible, right? How bold, like something like that. Yeah, I mean, I think the reaction was almost immediate from a lot of local Latino Democratic officials, right? One of the groups that we support, I spoke to just yesterday. I mean, she was telling me that they had a higher security for their office for the entire week because they were, number one, they were already getting death threats because they support farm workers, right? Now that the former president announced that he was going, it's just only become that much more magnified, right? And so I don't know. For me, it's just like almost kind of like a fear factor kind of thing. And so,
I also think they've been, for the last years, they've been doing a lot of outreach. When I even think of like the Central Valley and other regions, they've been doing so much outreach in evangelical churches. I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of pastors there that for the last 4 years, they've been really trying to merge the faith and MAGA. And I think that the way that people are being politicized in these sort of safe spaces, and that's sort of this that's also fueling all of this.
Yeah, and I think
I've seen a huge change in the last 4 years.
Well, and I think one of the pastors that you interviewed was from Sacramento, I believe, right?
Yes.
Samuel Rodriguez.
Yes.
And then he was at the Trump inauguration. He was, right? Yeah, we're out here, folks. And I'm just checking on the time, but in about less than half an hour, Vice President Harris will be speaking to the nation when she participates in a town hall on Univision. She's going to be talking to undecided Latino voters. I'm curious.
Well, you know what's funny about that? So Univision tried to get both of them, the vice president and Donald Trump, to do it in Miami. And her team was like, absolutely not. Like, we're not doing this in Miami. And so they ended up going to Nevada, right? Because Trump will do his next Wednesday in Miami in Univision, right. And then they're hosting hers in Nevada, which I think is smart.
Yeah,
it's the audience she needs.
Yeah, and to that end, and I hope people watch it after the fact. Thank you for being here.
Yeah. But if you haven't had enough politics, go keep.
I'm sure they'll have it on YouTube afterwards. But I mean, the question here is that. Do you think that she can actually win Latino voters who may have previously voted for Trump or maybe considering Trump? Or I'm wondering whether or not this is something where like the train has left the station.
I think so. I think what she'll try and do, and I've seen some clips, is really ground people, and I think that's kind of what's missing in the conversation, right? Donald Trump is going to Miami-Dade County because immigration isn't as personal there, She's going to Nevada, where just like in Arizona and even California, immigration is deeply personal. And I think what's missing in the conversation is grounding people back to the reality and the language of, this is what mass deportations look like. This is what it would look like. This is how policemen would be deputized to help him carry out what he has called this bloodbath. This is what it means to once again go knocking on your doors, and it has turned like family separation, right? Like the percentage of mixed status families in Nevada is huge. Yeah. Right? We're not just talking about an immigration problem; it is an American problem. And so my guess is that, as she sort of at a national level had to really become more moderate in her immigration speech, right? Because we're no longer sort of leading with comprehensive immigration reform. No, she's leading with border security. And I think at a national level that works. But when you go to Nevada, that has a huge percentage of mixed status families, you have to sort of show a little bit more compassion and ground people back into like, here's what's at stake, here's the risk. And my guess is that that's part of what she'll do tonight.
Yeah, and I'm curious, I mean, you used to be on the Clinton campaign in 2016. Like, I mean, how much of that experience went into writing this book?
Well, I mean, just even the difference, right? Like the way that Hillary Clinton closes her campaign is very similar to the way that Joe Biden closed his campaign. And the idea was closing with a very pro-immigration message that was sort of the distinguishing factor between Democrats and Republicans, right? Like one of the things that Hillary did was really integrate the idea of dreamers and DACA, and right, that was one of the biggest differences. The way that Joe Biden closed his 2020 campaign was reminding Americans, remember the way that children were crying at the border when they were being separated, right? And there were so many ads. Remember family separation. Remember zero tolerance. Like those were the last 2 weeks of his campaign. I think the clearest way to contrast the two messages. And now we're facing something that's completely different. A Democratic Party that has become more moderate when it comes to that specifically,
Sure.
And that has also, I think, understood the way that Latinos are changing. That perhaps the audience doesn't want that anymore. And the question is that sort of the effect of Trumpism, that has really molded our mind, or is that just really that we've changed? The compassion isn't there the way that it used to be. I'm not so convinced, but.
Yeah, we were talking backstage about whether or not Paula will write a third book, right?
No.
The trilogy of Latinos, right?
No. I know, I have this thing, it's like every 4 years there's an election, I'm like, oh, let me do it again, but no.
I know, I have a silly question, but kind of an important question. Can you help me understand Nicky Jam and his endorsement of Donald Trump?
Her?
Yeah, her.
Her endorsement?
Yeah, no, because I feel like all these reggaeton stars have been coming out, and if people remember, Daddy Yankee endorsed John McCain in 2008.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm like, there's a trend and a history here, and I'm like, where in the hell? Like, that's the third book right there.
Yeah, you can't help
Please
me
interview
write that
Daddy
one.
Yankee.
Yeah,
We'll be back here with him next year.
Yeah. Oh, that's a real question.
Yeah, it's a real question. Yeah.
No, I don't know. I mean, look, they gained nothing. I mean, the man didn't even know his gender. Like, right? I really don't even know what to make of that. I mean, look, everyone's entitled to endorse whomever they want to. And again, it's how confident he is. I mean, they're not even that famous, are they?
Are they? I don't know.
No, right, yeah. So it's like some people get Beyonce, like they get that. I mean,
well, Taylor Swift was pretty important. Yeah. Well, no, yeah, because I mean, when that moment happened, I was just curious. I'm like, well, who's he trying to talk to here?
Yeah.
Is it young Latino men or?
100%.
So, and I think the bigger question, like, does anyone care that Nicky Jam would support Donald Trump?
I mean, what was the other one? Anuel. I mean, but he has like millions of followers, right? So I also believe like it does have some effect, but even in that way, politics is changing so much, right? Like it used to be enough for like, these huge artists to endorse, but now it's like you really have to go at the local level to get the real local surrogate. So I don't know how much like.
Yeah. I think you're coming towards the tail end of your tour so far, right?
Yeah. A couple more stops. Yeah.
Okay, because then there's the election.
Right, yeah, then there's like life.
The big old election. I'm curious, Paula, have you thought about the book in a different way as you've gone on tour and talked to people and hear what they tell you about what they thought of the book and what they read? Have there been any surprising moments for you so far?
I mean, that's been the best part. I mean, this is great, but the best part has been hearing from everyone and just how much the conversation changes depending on the cities. In Miami, and I know this sounds cheesy, but they've almost become these like therapy sessions. And when we do the Q&A and people are just sort of speaking freely, even yesterday, like 3 people were crying, trying to make sense of the way that they felt this distance with their families, and sort of the trauma comes up a lot. But like in Miami, the conversation was all around like, how do we get our family members to really understand how these sort of conspiracy theories around communism aren't real? And that was the heart of that. In the Bronx, it was all about sort of a lot of like Afro-Latinos making sense of the growing Dominicans for Trump movement, and having conversations about race and colorism. So that was coming up there. Yesterday in Arizona, it was all about, I think there was a lot of pain because it was a lot of mixed status families that are seeing this trend immigrant families, and there's someone in the families that are now starting to really find something appealing in Trump. And that wasn't just about politics, but it felt really very, very painful and very personal for a lot of people. So yeah, I'm not saying that any of that justifies his thesis, but there is something there around, I think, a question that we're all sort of trying to wrestle with, which is, what does belonging look like? When we think of ourselves collectively today, maybe 30, 40 years ago, we knew what that answer is, but like, what do we have in common, no? When we think of defectors, defecting from whom? I mean, who were we supposed to be loyal to? And I think there's so many of us that are trying to come back together, but then there's a real pain of people that are choosing something else. And again, I think it goes beyond the politics. And so that's been interesting to make sense of.
No, yeah, I love that. Because the other thing I wanted to ask you is just the actual like cover of the book. I'm sure there was a process deciding like what kind of colors you wanted to use. And
that wasn't. They did this was how the publisher. They did an amazing job. Yeah, like initially.
Because this scares the shit out of me.
I know, me too. Like sometimes the worst is, I think it was my dad or my mom. They couldn't even understand like. They were like the Fed, like, and then they had to look down. Yeah, so hopefully it makes sense. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think to that end, I mean, like the title itself, like how did that come to be?
Well, I think it's a play of words, no? I think it's the idea of, for so many years, we thought that we were supposed to be loyal to one party, that we were supposed to, there was this collective solidarity around this one party with one goal. And I think now it's simply questioning, like, who are we loyal to? When you put the politics to a side, and when you ask people, when there's no cameras around, there's sort of this permission now that is giving people a lot of pathways towards Trumpism, no? And so it's kind of more of a play of words. And if you look at us and you look at the history and you look at some of these tendencies, and we've been defecting for a long time. No, I've defected many times. Like there was parts of me I talk a lot about sort of this idea of the way that I even like approached whiteness, when I was younger, living in Miami, where I believe that every Cuban American looked like me, or really talking about iterations of shame that I felt at the beginning when I had to come out, and why it took me so long. And so, I've defected in the sense that I believe that at times power looked this way, but really I felt better here, so.
Yeah. And actually in the first couple of pages of the book, I was just so struck by the history that you brought out, because I myself did not know that there were Latinos that were supporting the Confederacy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, whoa.
Right.
And then the question that came to mind is, I mean, I'm actually very fascinated. Like, how did you find that history? What was that process like?
No, I mean, it was just, this is the culmination of, like, I can do the reporting, but I'm not smart like that, right? Like, this is the culmination of, like, scholars and historians that when I met these people, like, when I was going to New Mexico, and I was talking to people like Mr. Ortiz, that he really was adamant around ensuring that the preservation of these, like, Spanish conquistador statues remained, and that manifests itself in different ways across the country, Even I have a very thick Spanish accent, because I grew up in Madrid, and it is what it is. Like, I still have it for 17 years of living in Madrid. And even sometimes when I'm having interviews with some folks, and they'll be like, no, pero es que tú hablas muy bien. Ese es el gran acento español. Tú no eres como nosotros. Again, that's fantasy heritage, the way that, that a lot of Latinos try to insert themselves in the white nationalist world, the entry point is typically to claim that Spanish colonizing past. And so I think what history showed me, which it's nothing new, but that's the way that these caste systems were always institutionalized. Like, we still carry that, the way that we've sort of been able to dance around race, to, in the idea of mestizaje, sort of hide, and that in and of itself has always created this permission structure for us to claim that direct line to whiteness. Like, I mean, there's examples in the book of how we've been allowed to reclassify race. And so, yes, in the United States,
Right.
that criminalizes black people and immigrants and brown people the way that it does, we can do that dance sometimes if it's convenient.
Absolutely. Yeah, and what struck me too is that, I mean, Latinos in this country are becoming more and more and more and more. And I mean, here in the state of California, we're 40% of the population,
Right.
Same thing in Texas. As we have this conversation, as we continue to talk about, this trend, right, of Latinos moving towards the far right, I'm curious, like, what you think the responsibility of the community is as we continue to hold such profound economic and political power, especially in the face of this election. What does that look like?
I mean, I think you're an example of that. I think your colleagues are an example of that. I think there is, and I don't ever want to underestimate like the important work that has been done, because I think, and that's something that came up yesterday. Even if Trump wins, and even if this happens, there's already an incredible foundation, an incredible movement. And I think the difference now compared to 20 years ago is that there is confidence that people will be okay because of the grassroots organizing that has happened. Going back to what sanctuary cities have been, going back to places of refuge, going back to the Know Your Rights campaigns, going back to that, that infrastructure has been built. So I think I never want to underestimate that work because it's there. And even again, leaving Arizona yesterday, like people were literally crying, thinking about that reality again. But then those tears turned into an optimism that I think maybe wasn't there 8 years ago, which was like, it will be okay, because there's that infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I believe that too.
No, for sure. I mean, that for me was like one of my big takeaways from your book, right? Because, as I mentioned, it scared the shit out of me.
Yeah.
But it's just rather amazing how, like, when you engage community in a real nuanced conversation, like, people can actually have productive conversations. I'm going to go to questions now. I have a couple, but for people like that still have lingering questions, I know the staff is going to bring it to me. But someone from the audience was asking around the issue of abortion and your thoughts on how this factors in for Latino voters going into this election.
I mean, I think so. When I think of the Hillary campaign, they would tell us to never say the word aborto ever. When we went to Texas or when we were engaging with the electorate, so particularly with Latinas, to never say the word aborto. And that was a big mistake because I think that stereotype has been baked in for so many years. This idea that you can't talk to Latinos about abortion. What we see now in the midterm elections was that for the first time in a really long time, the issue of abortion, obviously once Roe v. Wade really disappeared, the issue of abortion became one of the top issues for the community. And what that also showed is that within that, I'm also talking about people of faith, Catholic women, some evangelicals that were able to humanize the issue in a way maybe that they didn't have to many years ago. So I do think even when you look at the polls, there's a huge gender gap between obviously Latinos and Latinas, right? And she's doing very, very well with Latinas. And I think part of it is because this issue has become life and death for so many. Even though morally you may be opposed to it or not, what you see in conversations and in the polls is that people can humanize it. They can draw, they can sort of draw the empathy there. And so I just always think of that 2016 moment because we were just sort of feeding, that stereotype that wasn't real.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is an excellent question, so thank you, whoever submitted this one. But Republicans have aligned with Latin American right-wing leaders like Bolsonaro, Bukele, Milei. Why don't Democrats do the same with the Latin American left, especially popular leaders like AMLO?
Man, because I'm even thinking like the word progresista in a place like Miami is like allergic. I mean, people are like allergic to that word. No, truly, right? And I think, again, it's because, I mean, yes, I think there's there's a strategy there, and but I think that the backlash that would create to really associate themselves, at least in foreign policy, through that lens with like los progresistas latinoamericanos, given that so much, I think, of the strategy of Democrats too and Republicans has been precisely, I'm not justifying it, but so much of the core of that strategy has been to sort of tell Latinos that they will protect them from the socialism and the progressiveness and the communism that they're fleeing from Latin America. Like, that has been so baked into sort of the strategy of engaging Latinos. I'm not saying it's correct or not, but I would find it so, I think that's fascinating. I think breaking with that, I think that trauma of you're fleeing communism, like that's been so reinforced and conditioned for so many years.
Yeah, I think it follows to that question. Yeah. I mean, there's a new president in Mexico, right, Claudia Sheinbaum. And in this book, I mean, there are a lot of examples of men and women, right? Would that make a difference at all? Do you think, having like a strong, progressive female leader in Mexico?
Oh yeah, no, I think she's very popular. I mean, I think absolutely, and I think that sort of is part of the inspiration that I think some Latinos have in the vice president. Seeing that image here, but I think it goes beyond AMLO. I think I'm even talking about the word like progresista, de izquierdas. That I think we have to do a better job at really like grounding people in what that means, because for decades they've been really distorting the meaning of that.
No, absolutely. This next question, after meeting all these defectors, how does one bring them back from the misinformation and from their infatuation with Trump? Is there any hope for those of us who have lost our families to the far right?
I mean, I'm not here to advocate for anybody, for number one. Yeah. But what I try and do, and I think what you try and do, is just the reality we're in right now, which is bring people back to the facts. And 80% of the interviews that I have right now are with people that believe the big lie, that ultimately don't believe that Joe Biden is a president, that believe that there's an invasion, that believe that the Democratic Party is every day indoctrinating children into being transgender. And so 80% of my job has now been to listen and then come with my facts and be like, okay, I understand this is how you feel. Let me tell you what is actually happening. And that's literally my day and night. I think that makes a difference, but I mean,
yeah, no, it's thank you for bringing up that question, because I think even beyond Trump, there is going to be a day that we move beyond him, and I do wonder how we deal with the legacy that he's leaving behind.
And I think that's the fear, right? Because how do you come back from that? Like who we are 4 years after 2020, like we've changed so much. Right, like we're so, and again, I definitely want to leave on a more positive note, but I think that's kind of what we're up against. This brains have been changed, like facts are no longer facts, and so that's really hard.
No, absolutely. This next question, you mentioned briefly that anti-trans sentiment plays a role in the rightward shift of Latino voters. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so even my friend sent me a photo yesterday from Vegas, and there was this truck that basically was saying in Spanish something like, the vice president, Kamala Harris, in his, what was she say? Kamala Harris is using your money to fund for sex changes. And then it said, ella es una radical. And that is, I mean, I see that everywhere. I see that online. Obviously, that happened in Vegas. That's the same thing that Stephen Miller was trying to do in Colorado in 2022. The same message. They would sort of pass around these transphobic flyers in like 3 or 4 districts that had a very heavy Spanish-speaking Latino community, and the language was the same. They took it even further. It was, they're pedophiles, they're indoctrinating your children, everything in Spanish. And so the idea, I think, I mean, that's happening all the time, no? The idea there is that among certain men, that will sort of invoke a moral panic that is familiar, because it sort of creates this this unpleasant feeling in the face of a country that is going through different gender dynamics and gender norms and sexual norms, and sort of faced with people like us, this difference. And I think the idea there is to really get people to feel that discomfort, and going back to the anti-immigrant sentiment, it's the same thing. It's the same elements that we're talking about, Instill fear, instill anger, instill resentment, and instill disgust. And all of those are elements that really drive people to dehumanize. And you can just sort of recycle that strategy. Put immigrants there, put trans people there, put black trans migrants there, which is what Trump tried to do. But it's the same strategy. And of course, it doesn't work all the time, but in conversation, I have to say it comes up a lot. The idea of like, they're trying to indoctrinate you guys. And I'll tell you one more thing. In one of the recent interviews I did in Arizona, and I think it comes down to that feeling that I'm describing, I was interviewing a Trump supporter, and this guy starts walking towards me, and he was armed, and he just starts staring at me. And I'm doing the back and forth in my interview, and the guy just is standing there going like this. I have to stop because he was making me feel uncomfortable. Yeah. And I asked him, I was like, can I help you? And he was just like, there's just something about you. And I was like, okay. And I was like,
that you're awesome?
No. You're so sweet. No. He just said, like, there's something about you. And he had this face, and I was like, what do you mean? He's like, and he just kept saying that there's just like something about you. And that's the feeling, that's what they're trying to invoke in people, to look at you with like disgust and fear. And I think that's kind of what's behind the like anti-LGBTQ message that they're really weaponizing.
Yeah, this next question, how did you separate your story as a daughter of an immigrant from the subjects of this book? And how did you survive this writing process? Because I can imagine it took quite a bit of time to put this all together. I could barely write an email.
No. I actually wrote the book very fast. I wish I hadn't. I wrote the whole thing in 9 months, which is crazy. Wow. I would never do that again. But because by the time we're on the road, I'm reporting, and then by the time that I decided, all right, I really want this to come out before the election, it literally was like last year. So I had no life for 8 months, and I did it. That's a question we get all the time, right? Like, when do you put your journalist hat and when are you a human? And how do you balance that? And the truth is, no matter what they tell you, as much as you strive for objectivity, which of course we do, sometimes you're always a human first. And so I never back away or shy away from who I am. Sometimes I can't, and I always integrate that into my questions, into the framing, in a way that I think humanizes the conversations, but Yeah,
and I think it just maybe a follow-up to that question. I mean, you come from a family of journalists. I mean, what's been...
I had no choice, okay?
Yeah, I know, but the family business, right? No. But what's been the best advice that you've gotten from any of them?
Well, I think my dad is really good in interviews, no? He's scary. But he's taught me to, particularly when you're having sort of contentious interviews, he's like, treat the first 3 minutes as if they were your last. No? So always like, what are the 3 top questions? And always think of them as if they're about to leave. Again, that's why he's had so many problems. Which has happened. Right. But I think that, and then really the idea of questioning things, challenging things, questioning power. So I try and do that a lot. And then my mother, who has a bigger heart, is just always being, yeah, I love my dad. I do. He's great. But just the empathy and the compassion, just always being humble. And I think sometimes this job is very transactional.
Sure.
You go in, you ask for interviews, you do a video, and there's something very transactional about that. And so just always, just being conscious of that, of the optics of that, and building relationships. And so she really sort of grounds me in that.
This is a fun one. Would Marco Rubio, as Trump's VP pick, have made an impact on the Latino community in this election?
I don't think so. What do you guys think? I don't...
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there was the issue of 2 Floridians on the ballot, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and he just seems like... Also, the Cuban, yes, in Florida, yeah, but they're so good with Florida. Like, they're even 2 days ago, there was already a poll that shows him winning the Latino vote there. He wasn't winning last time, but now he really is. So I think in a state like Florida, he would really have a presence. But I don't know. I find him, not that J.D. Vance is, any better, but J.D. Vance, I think, has this sort of this like deeper ideology, and he really can think through like these messages. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit, but I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
What do you think?
Well, I'm not allowed to think on questions like that.
Sorry. No, me neither.
Yeah,
you guys,
right.
I can't. Yeah.
So this is a nonpartisan space.
Yes.
And before I forget, with the remaining couple of minutes left, thank you to the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco. To Mark over there on the AV and Chris and the team here. I'm avoiding the questions. So, I guess maybe I'll try to fit these two last questions in.
Okay.
But, one person asked, is the Latino community unique or reflective of all Americans?
I think we're unique. I think even when this question comes up all the time, like what is Latinidad? Like what does sort of unite us? I still believe that there's something so beautiful about the idea that regardless of how many generations in we are in this country, and regardless of who we are, the only thing we really have in common is that original, that immigrant story. The idea that someone came to this country for the very same reason. And that is to find a little bit more opportunities here than those that they left behind, to find more rights here, to find more liberties here. And I do think that's a really powerful story that I think can be passed around through generations. I think that makes us compassionate. I think that makes us empathetic people. So I do tend to believe, and I say this at the end of the doom and gloom, like I do believe that we can come back to that, and that makes us very, very unique, I think.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, because I think this next question also maybe ties into that, because this person asks, they're wondering what does unify Latinos? Are there any universal experiences or values that you think just ties us all together?
I would go back to that. I think, when in all the conversations across the country that I always have, it is that origin story. I think the tendency now is to get us to erase that origin story, or this idea that through assimilation and as we've become Americanized, that we sort of will detach ourselves from that, and that certainly is happening. But I think, I'll even tell you this, one of the, obviously within the evangelical space, Donald Trump is doing really well with Latino evangelicals, and I had a conversation with a woman from Wisconsin that started the Latina Evangelicals for Harris. And I was like, and how are you doing it? Because you guys are really losing ground there. And she said, I'm trying to bring people back to that origin story. And that's my entry point, reminding people like this story sort of has informed and should inform your values. And I thought that was really interesting. That's her entry point into red states, into red territories, into people that have already flipped, bring them back to that. And I thought I agree with that.
No, it's awesome. Yeah, so I guess maybe a final question here is, and this may be an obvious one, right? Because the answer should be everybody, but who should be reading this book? Especially in this moment right now, because right now in California, many of us who are registered voters have now received our ballots. Yeah. And the Latino voters are going to be sliced and diced. It's going to be a lot, right? Who do you really want to read this book right now in this moment of time in our country?
You said it for me. I think it's for everyone, because I think if we believe that 2045 was going to look a certain way, and if we believe that democracy, again, regardless of how people identify politically, that democracy was going to sort of, survive in the face of some forces that are really threatening these principles, then no matter how you slice it, Latinos are at the heart of that. And so I think to have the curiosity of how we're behaving, I think everyone should be doing that. And then I really think, yes, obviously Republicans, but honestly, a lot of Democrats should be doing it. Many people don't love this book in the Democratic Party right now because it sort of questions and challenges a lot of those theories. And I think, again, it's conversations that I wish I would have been having in the Hillary campaign, teaching us about the colorism and the racism, and even I think that would have helped us even see people that we weren't seeing. It would have helped us in the outreach, it would have helped us in the conversation. So I think, I think Democrats should try and take it seriously.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I would say, I mean, other than just presidential politics here in San Francisco, there's an important mayor's race.
Yes.
Where I feel like I have my homegirl over here on the side.
I know.
But yeah, I mean, Latino voters are everywhere. And, it's such a powerful voting bloc. I'm going to try to do this in less than 3 minutes, but Paula, I almost feel like it's a campaign for your book, right? And
I know, you're
what's
like
your
doing all
closing
my
statement?
PR. My closing statement.
Yeah. Any last words you want to give to the audience?
Well, no, first of all, just thank you all again for taking the time. I definitely don't want to end on a sort of, and also this isn't a pessimistic conversation. I mean, there's two sort of stories happening at the same time. No, there's this, and I think, again, that this is only about having these human conversations, but I think the other side of the story is incredible too, and that is the younger generation of Latinos. That is a younger generation, the Gen Zers, the younger millennials, that I think I really admire, because I think they're leaning into their identities with a lot more pride, and they're leaning into their rights with a lot more pride. They're challenging the Democratic Party more, and that really excites me, where that's headed, and I think it's an interesting moment, to make sense of those two things. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, big round of applause for Paula Ramos.
Thank you. Thank you to you.
Yeah, thank you
so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I got to make sure I close this out right. but yeah, and again, really, truly, a big thank you to the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco. I was joking with Paula, this is probably the fanciest event she'll do on her book tour.
I know.
Right. A special invitation to one of their upcoming programs titled October Surprise, What Could Derail Harris and Trump? Probably Latinos. Right? Join us to look at, this is the October Surprise, right? Yeah, and I guess I'll just close out with this, with 1 minute left. I don't think history should not be lost on us. 40 years ago, here in this space, maybe not in this space, but the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, Cesar Chavez spoke to the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, and here we are, two Latino millennials talking about the power of our community.
What would he think of this, man?
I'll ask his grandson right now. I'm going to call him right now. Right? But no, it just goes to show, it's a very fascinating conversation, so much to dissect, but I really do think you've done us a public service, Paula, by writing this book, because it's a really important conversation, and a conversation that we should all be having. And with that, I'll let people come up and talk to you, because I know, it's going to be exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out
guys.
tonight.
Thank you.